So now we have a talk that is going to be prepared by Leon, based around the topic of what does it take to break into UX. So Leon, as you all know, is a huge design nerd, a UX educator, and the founder of UXGO. In his professional career, Leon has done UX at Neo, Google, Amazon, VR, startups, Expedia, and a running list. He's currently he's a product design lead at GoDaddy. So please welcome Leon back to the stage.
So my presentation will be a little bit longer, and it will be a little bit more in depth. So all of you now from our speakers, if you weren't too familiar with UX, hopefully you are now a lot more familiar with what UX is. So the big three in UX right now, I would say, is UX design, UX research, and content design. But for many of you here, upperclassmen, you may have done an internship already. You may be looking specifically for new grad opportunities. Some of you may have been very new to UX and trying to break into that first internship role or any sort of unpaid work that just gets you more experience. So how can we break into UX, right? I think that's the question that is on everyone's mind. So who here has heard of the term design thinking? Just quickly raise your hand if that's something you are familiar with. So it doesn't look like we have any more tote bags, but does anyone want to do a quick shout out and just participate? What does design thinking mean to you? Does anyone want to raise their hand, give a quick answer? Any brave volunteers? Now I know how the professors feel when they ask a question. Okay, do we have someone in the back?
It's a framework to approach your design process.
Awesome. Did you get that from the image or did you know that?
I got it from the image.
Okay, yeah, but I bet you knew it too. Okay, so yes, that's a great way to think about design thinking. But something I want to pose to all of you, especially if you know you want to be a designer or a UX person in your career, design thinking shouldn't be something you switch on or off, right? If you have design thinking, I assume that's something you always have, even in your everyday life, right? When you run into a problem, you think about the problem as a designer. You don't just say, well, I finished my classes today, I'm gonna stop thinking like a designer, right? Hopefully that's not who you are. So the first concept I wanna propose to you that will help you break into UX is you want to really go with this idea that design thinking is a way of life, right? All of you are on your journeys of becoming UX experts in the future. So the question I want to pose in relation to how to break into UX is, how would you approach your career or life in general if it was a product, right? If you were the designer, researcher, or content designer, whoever you may be, if you take your design thinking, how would you plan and approach this project? So I'll give everyone a second to pause and think about it. No need to shout out any answers, but I do want all of you to actively reflect on this. So should you start right at your applications? Who here thinks that the best way to start would be right at applications? I see in the middle a nice head shake. Yes, you are absolutely correct. That is not a good place to start. Should you start maybe at networking? Does anyone think networking would be a great place to start? Seems like more head shakes. So what about with your portfolio or resume reviews? Does that sound like a good place to start? I see some like some head shakes. Yeah, so mostly unsure, right? One metaphor I can give all of you is why some of these places are very terrible to start at is if you think about like a product, let's say you are about to open up your own boba tea store. Starting right at applications would be the equivalent if you went to sign a lease. If you went to sign a lease immediately. That is obviously not a good choice to run a business or to promote your product. Starting right at networking could be, you start promoting your drink right away. But maybe you haven't even figured out what you want to sell. So probably also not a good place to start. So one question I want to pose then, if we use design thinking to think about your career, where would you start your design, right? You don't want to start it at anywhere that's Sorry, adjusting it a little bit. You don't want to start it right at wireframes or prototypes. So the process to success in UX, especially when you're breaking into it for the first time, you should take a design thinking heavy approach. So I broke down my presentation into 3 chapters for everyone. Just like doing a project or a product, the first thing you want to do is you want to start out research, right? This is where you define your goals. This is where you define what you want to do. This is where you define your context, your requirements, your needs, right? Who here has done at least one UX project here at UW or in your own time? So does all of this seem very familiar to you when you've done your product? Yes, hopefully it's yes. If you haven't done any research before when you do design, then your designs are hard to succeed, right? Second, we'll talk about iteration, and we'll talk about delivering results. So your career goal should be something that you set intentionally. It's like when you start your project, you teach this idea of a how might we statement, right? All of you hopefully have heard of what a how might we statement is. It's also commonly known as a problem statement. So I've coached and mentored, I would say, over 50 students across different universities just last year. The most scary thing for a student to say is when you ask them what their goal is, and they say something like, well, I want to become a UX designer in big tech. Please don't feel offended if you feel like that's something you've said before, but this may seem like a normal goal for people to have, right? But if you really think about it and you take that design thinking approach, having this goal would be like if you are designing a product and your how might we statement is, how might we make the best-selling app possible? It doesn't really mean anything, right? If you pitch that, people don't really know what you mean or have any idea what you want to design. So my follow-up to students has always been, well, how do you plan to reach this goal? And then this is where I'm greeted with this, I'm not sure. So you can see this sort of thinking is an effective way to do goal setting, because in the world of UX, when we have a goal, when we do our research, the whole point is for us to have a roadmap and plan to reach that goal. So what do you do in UX when you're not sure how to reach something, right? This is where research comes in. So as you plan for your career goals, you need to understand the space you're in. In other words, the industry's relation to you, and I mean you specifically. Who are you? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What do you want to be in the UX world? What is your long-term goal, right? So I wonder if all the coaches and speakers agree with me today on this, but I view the world of professional UX sort of like acting. That first breakthrough is often the hardest, but once you have your foot in the door, you'll find that there are plenty of new opportunities. So that is exactly what I want all of you to know. This first breakthrough is going to be the hardest, and it's not going to have easier alternatives. So if, right now, think hard about yourself. Are you really into UX because you enjoy the things that the speakers just shared about what their day-to-day lives are? Or are you doing this because you feel like it's an easier alternative than perhaps coding if you want to work in tech? Because obviously, if it's the latter, then you are going to have not a pleasant time when you try to break into UX. So this goes into our first key concept of today. I want you to acknowledge that everyone in UX is quite unique. So unlike coding and other disciplines where maybe you take a bar test if you want to become a doctor, you take a CPA test if you want to become an accountant, everyone in UX is unique. You all are very different from the folk next to you. So when you spend time to research, you are researching to understand yourself first. The best way to understand yourself is you want to be able to play to your strength. Some examples I can give you. All of you are coming from different backgrounds today. If you are coming from a business background, that isn't necessarily a weakness. It could be something you could leverage. Some of the folks here today may be coming from an architecture background for your undergrad. I've worked with a lot of students like that. Do we have anyone here coming from an architecture background today? It looks like we do have a few, right? And architecture is a very hardcore study for undergrad, right? It's 5 years. It's very intense. We may have folks coming from another design background, such as industrial design, fashion design, or maybe traditional visual design where you just want to switch into UX. And then we may have folks coming from a CS engineering background, such as if you are from HCDE, you might have taken a lot of engineering classes. And then we may have folks like myself and Shanri here who come from more traditional art and creative backgrounds. So when you do this research and understand yourself, it's very important that you keep reminding yourself it's okay to be unique. And you want to embrace this uniqueness of yourself. Your unique background means that you should not try to follow a cookie cutter formula. If you ever attend a talk or if you listen to someone's advice where they try to tell you to be someone you're not, then do you really think that's going to work out in your favor when you do your goal setting? It probably wouldn't. And this is one of the reasons why when I spoke with Rachel and some other mentors of mine, we really have this stigma and we think that boot camps are sort of promoting a very wrong message. Because when you go to a boot camp program, which I know some of you may have done before, it is quite different from taking a class at UW, and it's quite different from getting the skills you actually need as a UX designer. And the reason why is because bootcamp concepts and maybe certification programs such as like Google UX certificate, they are misleading. Bootcamp is an idea that came from the coding world when coding became insanely popular. If you look back 10, 20 years, if you study computer science, you can't really find a job at all because there wasn't that many IT roles that needed computer science. But suddenly with the internet boom and everything, right, CS became the most in-demand thing. And all these other engineers, they wanted to transition. So what they did was they're like, okay, why don't we open like a 3-month camp and then these people just learn the basics and they can go off on their own. This is the idea of a boot camp, right? So what works very well for computer science and engineering definitely does not work for our UX world. But because UX is closely tied with tech, and many students who may not be as privileged to be able to join a university like UW or another very prestigious design program, they are met with a difficult time trying to break into UX and they're not really sure what is needed from them. So then they see an ad that says, take our class. I don't want to name any specific bootcamp, but take our class. In 3 months, you'll be a UX designer and you'll be making, I don't know, like let's say 10K salary a year. Does that sound correct? No, 10K a month. Yeah, that sounds more correct. So you'll be making 10K salary a month. And then you know what the student says? They're like, that seems like a small price to pay for $12,000 right now. If I can make 10K a year, right? 10K a month. So you know what? They sign up. And what the boot camps do is, like not every student can afford it, of course. So they say, well, you can do your salary share if you find a job, right? So it is quite predatory. Oftentimes it doesn't work for the student's favor. Of course, some students do benefit from it because it might be their only option or best option to learn UX. But generally, what they promote is they want everyone to be the same because that's how they can offer you their classes, right? They teach everyone the same thing. They want you to do the same thing. But then the result is very obvious. Everyone has the same result where they don't become a UX designer. So one thing I do want to promote, not because we are at UW, but your programs at UW are a lot better. I've talked with a lot of students individually, so I know sometimes depending on your program or your classes, it is quite frustrating, right? You feel like a huge disconnect between what you're learning and the industry. If you're from the HCDE side, some of you might have taken classes with Axel where you've learned things like nuclear power plants going wrong or planes about to crash. And then you ask, like, how the hell does this have anything to do with me designing an app, right? But what you need to remember is the whole point of school is it's promoting your critical thinking and teaching you the soft skills needed so you can learn those hard skills, maybe how to design better on Figma on yourself. You don't want to be paying all this tuition to learn something you can learn on YouTube yourself in 15 minutes, right? So that's something I want you to think about. When you look at your classes at UW, just remember, all these classes are supposed to help you succeed by you being you. These classes are not designed for you to become someone else or become the same person as who is sitting right next to you. So that's why when you're a student and you're thinking very hard about the technical skills, that's not all what I want you to think about when you research and plan out your career. Yes, if you are new, if you're a freshman, if you're, I think someone mentioned engineering undergrad undeclared. I remember those days. It's very frustrating. So if you know you want to be a UX designer or a researcher, I'm not saying it's not important for you to learn these technical tools early. One of my advantages was I'm very technically skilled. That's how I was able to find a lot of jobs while attending school. So I was able to work full-time while studying part-time. So I'm not saying these things aren't important, but this is just part of your research, right? When you're researching yourself, you're really identifying who you are in a big picture, and then you come up with these concrete improvements or skills you need to learn. So this goes into the second topic we are talking about today. The best way to do research, just like you might have learned at school, is primary research. But primary research is very expensive. You need to hire very qualified folks like Kirsten to do it for you. But even if it's not hiring a UX researcher in the industry, primary research takes a lot of time, right? When you research yourself, what is equivalent of primary research is finding experiences and spending time with these experiences to learn who exactly are you. And then when you do this, you'll start to find that you have different skills you need to grind out. Maybe when you do your class projects, now you want to think about them differently. Rather than just thinking of it as getting a grade or a portfolio piece, you want to think about what is the result of me learning this, right? What am I getting out of it in the sense that how does this tie into my larger goal? And this could be finding paid or unpaid work, personal projects, side projects. The whole point is these should all be self-driven things done by you because you want to gain these experiences from a wide variety of ways. So as you do all these things, just make sure you have a strong end goal in mind, right? So once again, using the idea of a roadmap, when you have a larger roadmap created through gaining all these experiences, right? I'm not telling you right now today you need to be able to come up with a good 5-year goal with concrete milestones because coming up with this good goal actually takes time. So as you do all this research and get all these experiences, keep improving your goal, right? Keep coming up with it. Keep making it more easy to be attained by you. So as you go through these experiences, you will now uncover how you being you does or does not do great UX. And that is the best way you can improve. So one more concept here I want to talk about is what's a good goal, right? We talked about everything on a high level. So what does a good goal actually sound like? So maybe after grinding all this out from your projects, from your personal experiences, from your side projects, a good goal could sound something like this. Based on my experiences doing XYZ, I know research is the area I'm strongest in. So I plan to become a researcher and leverage my connections that I've made through ABC to break into the industry. Since I have done a lot of startup work in the fintech space, I could use this first breakthrough into big tech as a new grad, right? I could work at a company maybe like Intuit. And then I can slowly transition into managing my own research team, which is where my true passion lies. So in 5 to 10 years, I can become a manager in this space. This is the process of what setting a realistic but achievable yet actionable goal sounds like. So now, of course, I do want to talk about the flip side of things, right? It's important to play devil's advocate, especially when someone just stands in a podium and says a bunch of things to you, right? It's important to think critically about, what is all this stuff Leon just said? Does it even make any sense? Like, is it actually achievable, right? You might say something like, well, I'm already going to school, doing all these projects, taking 18 credit classes. I might be doing my own work on the side, working at a coffee store to support my tuition. How can I possibly make all this time to get all this extra research just to find myself, right? Does this really sound feasible? So one idea I want to say is those are all very fair arguments, and I'm a very empathetic person towards others. So I will admit all of us are going through generally a lot of crap in life. So there's always stuff that doesn't go the way we plan it to. But if time is what you need, then you really need to try to make time. So some of you now might say, well, I don't think that's a good argument, right? As someone who's speaking from you with certain experiences, you might say, well, that's easy for you to say since you already made it to the top, or you've already broken into the industry, and you have all these awesome experiences that people can say about you, line up one after the next. But I want to say I am actually someone who's really crawled my way up here. So I am definitely not someone who has survivorship bias. If you are someone who knows me, whether you're a student who's worked with me before, may have taken a guest lecture class that I've taught at UW, or read any of my articles on Medium, you know that my journey into UX is very, very difficult, and I went through a lot of struggles. So that is why when you sort of discover yourself and listen to advice from other folks, I do also want to promote this idea that don't listen to folks that tell you that it's supposed to be easy, right? These are the worst sort of advice. They might tell you things like, hey, breaking into UX is easy, just get an internship, like duh, and then you can get a job. They might say something like, hey, just make a really good portfolio, right? What are you waiting for? These are folks who commonly, I'm not saying they're bad designers, but they might have had a very pleasant and successful early career where that was what happened to them. They might have just made a really killer portfolio, they got a job, and they ended up working at that company for 5 to 10 years. I'm not saying that's possible, but they might not have a lot to teach you. So I now do a lot of education and teaching because mentorship in UX is something I'm very passionate about. And because I've had a more turbulent journey, which I'll share in just a bit with everyone, I think that it's very important for us to know that we should expect our first experience of breaking into UX to be difficult, right? This is what I talk about in my articles or in some of my online classes, teaching Figma or other tools you may have seen. So I focused on my industry a lot. Even when I was in school, I've worked full-time when I was studying part-time, which was not something that was easy. So you might think, well, these are all really awesome things. I don't hear how these are challenges or an uphill battle yet. Well, don't worry, we are getting to that part soon. So going to the story time, naturally, I think a big part of why I have been able to work very hard and working these often 40 to 80 hours a week is very early in my own personal life, before we can really call it a career, before high school and before all that, I was someone who never really studied a single day. So hopefully all of you have studied before, but for me, I never studied. So ever since elementary school, I have been failing all my classes. So a funny story I can share is nowadays on TikTok, what I get recommended the most is algebra tips for middle school people. And I keep watching them because I'm actually curious, how can they calculate this fraction, right? So this is something definitely I'm not proud to share, but it's interesting. So I am definitely relying on my wife to teach our future kids all that stuff. But one skill I've always had, even when I was never studying and sort of, I honestly can't tell you what I've been doing when I was young because it's probably not appropriate. But one thing I always had was I am someone who had a lot of focus. So in other words, I am amazing at grinding things out, if that's a term you like to use. So back in my high school days, in just a few months, I was able to double my SAT scores from maybe 1,100 to 2,200. That plus, like a killer essay about how I never studied a single day, but was able to, work really hard and get a good grade now, is probably the only reason I was even able to get into UW for the first place. So I'm very grateful of this opportunity, of course, but the one thing I lacked was I lacked the ability to do good goal setting, bless you, like I've been saying so far. So I couldn't put my focus and dedication to good use because once I'm in college now, what the hell am I supposed to do? I don't know anything, right? Like many college kids, I don't understand who I was or what I even want to do in my life. Now, since I grew up in a very traditional Asian family, is anyone here growing up from a very traditional Asian family? Can you quickly clap your hands? Just give me some motivation. Okay. So this is probably something you can relate to. My parents really wanted me to be an engineer. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Okay. So I was like, okay, well, I might as well give it a try since, I doubled my SAT grades in like 2 months, so I'm probably like a secret genius or something. So I'm like, okay. Which, of course, if you all are familiar with UW, trying to do CS with no CS background and no mathematical background is not feasible. So I got very terrible grades, like 2 point something at UW, and I was back into my old habits, of failing all my classes, even though, to me, I felt like I was trying. So I was very frustrated. Once again, I didn't know what I wanted to do. On my own time, I had all these storytelling skills from doing film production, all these visual skills from my art background. I loved drawing. I had a lot of entrepreneurship and crazy business ideas, but it all seemed like it was just a pipe dream where whatever I tried, it was getting shut down in whatever endeavor, and there was nothing that belonged to me at UW. So even though I knew I wanted to be this creative person, to my parents, that sounded more like an excuse, right? All of this pushed me into a very low point, also combined with the fact that I was living in a basement near campus with no windows and the water is always leaking. So that plus the fact that new to college, being on my own, I picked up a lot of bad habits that I'm not proud of, such as being an alcoholic, right? Going to classes since I knew I was going to do bad. I see a lot of you with like happy lemon drinks. So one thing I would do is I would have just spiced my drinks with vodka and then drank the boba in class. And then I remember at one point in my freshman days, I would even drink for 50 to 60 days straight. So yeah, that's the right reaction. So this, of course, led me to have even worse relations with my family, and they were done with my creative pursuits, right? And since my parents were very traditionally Chinese, Asian, very strict, the conversation we had after near the end of freshman year was they would just cut my tuition and I could try to figure out how to make a living on my own. All that said, very serious and all, I think is the tough love moment for me that I needed. Because this was when I realized up to this point, all I have ever done is to keep myself in my comfort zone and do what other people have asked me to do. I didn't take or study the SATs because that's in my plan. It's just what everyone else was doing, so I knew I had to do it too. I thought to myself, if I really had all this love for creatives and design and all this love for storytelling, then why don't I find my way of doing it, of breaking into the career? I should be the one setting the goals. I should be the ones finding a way to do it, not expecting UW to be giving me that class where, take this class, in 3 months, you'll be a UX designer. Does that sound familiar, right? That doesn't exist in real life. So with this new motivation, a fire has been lit inside of me. So nowadays, of course, it's a lot easier to work full-time while going to school since many jobs are remote. But back then for me, this was very hard. So what I wanted to do was I still wanted to study design. And I know UW has a lot of good resources. So I didn't want to give that up. And I thought, it would probably be a very bad idea to drop out of college. So I told myself I will do whatever it takes to support my own tuition, but I am staying within the creative field. I am not going to try to be an engineer or be someone I'm not. So to gain all this valuable work experience, sort of do research like what I just taught all of you, I ended up using my bilingual skills to find a contract job for a design agency in China. And I did exhibit designs for this company. What was really cool about this company was they actually worked with international clients like BMW, Mercedes, and Amazon. So they needed someone who could speak Chinese and English very well while being in the US, while knowing how to do design. So that was a very specific set of requirements. So I was able to do very good work with them. But a funny story I did want to share is when I interviewed with them, the only thing I actually really knew how to do at that point was I was bilingual. I did not know how to do any of these design tools they were asking for. Unity, never heard of it. What else they need? They were using a tool called Cinema 4D. Has anyone heard of it? I think it's a bit more popular nowadays. Just came out back then. No idea what it was. But you know what I said? I said I am well-versed in it. That is what I said. So of course I lied about everything other than being bilingual, since my only real design training up to that point has been Design 166. Who here has taken that class before? I know Rachel was actually a TA for that class since she was part of our very competitive MDes program. So 166 is a very brutal class, but I didn't really actually know anything about design. And the ugly truth was I didn't even get into the interaction design program, the one I finally wanted to get into, but I didn't know what I could do after that, right? But of course, the agency didn't need to know about all this. As far as they were concerned, I was a design student in one of the top design schools, studying interaction design, knowing how to do all these tools, being bilingual. I don't know what else, but they were like, you're the perfect candidate for the job. So they gave me the job. But obviously, this put me in a very challenging situation. I traveled back to China for this duration initially, since we were working with a lot of clients back and forth. One thing I did to make sure I could actually deliver was what I would do is I would get the tasks, and then I would spend 4 hours per day watching tutorials on YouTube, learning how to actually do it. And then I would do my job during the day. So in other words, I was pulling all-nighters almost every day. All of this, however, really made me learn a lot of technical tools that actually helped me later down in my career, right? When I'm doing VR design, I use Unity a lot. So things that you don't predict tying together actually all ties together in mysterious ways. So during this process, I was iterating on myself quickly and learning through many of these experiences. I did such a great job with them that eventually when I came back to US for school, one of the clients I worked with, which was NEO, so does anyone know NEO? If you follow EV stocks, it's kind of like Lucid, or it's the Tesla of China. So they are a very interesting company that was starting out back then. So I've kept working with them while I was studying here in the US remotely, and they gave me all sort of projects to support. So folks were really happy with my work. And then one thing led to the next, right? I was able to use all these experiences I've got to work at VR startups alongside all sorts of other client projects. Even at the time, Google was still doing their VR product at the time, so Google Daydream even reached out to me because that was the early days of VR, and they wanted me to interview to work on one of their products later that year. So all of this actually happened, which sounds like a lot of stuff, right? It all happened within 1 year. So it's in a very condensed amount of time. But all of this was only able to happen because through this journey of iteration, I was always being self-critical. I was putting myself in situations where, looking back, I don't even know how I pulled them off. But I used these scattered dots to pull everything together. This was when I eventually reached out to Karen, who is the sort of lead professor in our design schools. I asked her for a chance to reapply to our design program. And you know what Karen replied to me? She said, "Who are you?" Because I have never met Karen up to that point. So I told Karen, I went through all this crap. I feel like I wasn't in a good place before, but now, I'm really trying to use design to set my life straight. I have a lot of passion for this, right? Even if, you don't give me the chance to reapply, I know I'll be doing this for the rest of my life. But if I'm able to get into the interaction design program, I know my life and career will be easier. So Karen said, Karen's a very strict person. So Karen said, okay, sounds reasonable enough. So you can go back and write me a 10-page essay on how I should give you the chance to reapply. This is actually a true story, by the way. I saw some IXD folks in the back doubting if this happened or not, but this was very Karen moment. And then something else, after I turned in my 10-page essay, Karen talked with the advisor, and they said, of course, if you're this committed, we'll give you a shot. But the advisor told me my chances of getting in are about 400 to 1 because the IXD program, unlike HCDE or Info, does not really accept reapplies. That's not a thing. So if you want to take this shot, go for it, but be ready to be rejected is, in other words, what they told me. But, putting in all this time and effort, luckily, I spent 1 quarter worth of time redoing all my 166 projects to show my dedication. I wrote an essay regarding to all the experiences I've gained. I talked about my unique insights into design, and I was able to get in. So that's what I ended up studying. And through that time, since I've already spent the 1 extra year at UW, I was able to be a part-time student, which gave me more time to work in the industry. So that's what I want to share based off of why something that's very turbulent or something that doesn't start off in a pleasant way with doing proper research and understanding yourself can be very good for you. So moving on to sort of the next chapter I want to talk about, this idea of iteration and running into challenges. Like designing a product, you are bound to run into challenges. I hope it's not as, serious or as challenging as the ones I have to deal with, but who knows, maybe in your career, in your life, there are more going on than what I've been through. So like our designs, this process of being critiqued and tested and challenged on, it's not really a bad thing. So if we keep with our design thinking metaphor, what do we do when things do not go as planned? You iterate, right? This is a common practice we do. And you need to keep iterating in order to be successful. The question is, how can someone iterate on themselves, right? Is it just about getting, as many work experience as possible? So this is where, like the story I shared, putting yourself out there, especially in these challenging situations, is very valuable, because only two scenarios will happen. A, you overcome the challenge and you become a better version of yourself, whether that's a designer or a researcher. B, you struggle and you get to learn from your mistakes and still become a better designer or researcher. So in other words, the more challenging the situation is, it's really more of a win-win opportunity for you. But the key of all that is you need to be self-critical and aware in a positive and constructive way. This is where one thing I want to caution everyone sitting here today is, during this process of iteration, it is very easy for you to start comparing yourself with others. This was something I often done, and I always felt unmotivated and I felt very stressed. Because in my mind, I always felt like I wasted that first year of my life, or even in fact, probably all of my high school and before, since I never studied a single day. So when you start comparing with others, in a way, it's doing competitive analysis in your design, but that's all you do. Imagine you're designing a product, but all you've ever done is competitive analysis. You will have no idea what your real user needs are, and you will have no idea what sort of product you're supposed to design. So keeping with that design thinking approach, competitive analysis is something you should do in careful doses. So of course, be aware of what everyone else is doing. That's valuable. But even if you think of recruitment as a competition, you should always be focusing on yourself and how you're doing. So coming back to a little bit of an example within my own story, by the time I graduated, I already have had well over 4 years of work experience, working at all sorts of these companies, big name clients, whether it's through internship, contract roles, or other client projects. So like Shanri introduced, if you didn't listen through my presentation, you might have assumed I graduated a long time ago. But I was able to graduate recently with all these experiences, and one thing I noticed was many of my peers at the time when I was graduating were still looking for like internship or new grad roles, when I was interviewing with a lot of big tech companies such as Meta, Amazon for mid-level or senior roles by then, right? But if you only limit yourself to what you know is the standard or what everyone else is doing, you might also miss out on a lot of potential for your own career, right? So the challenge you should give yourself is, like when you're designing a product, your goal should always be designing the best product possible, right? So for your own career, don't limit yourself in a box. Break out of that. What is the most you can achieve in your career? It doesn't need to be conventional. It doesn't supposed to be what everyone else is going through. So that's why even now, I always keep myself running and I always pursue the next big thing. I don't like to keep myself comfortable. So I had a really good time at Expedia, but when the next opportunity arose where I could potentially be the product design lead at GoDaddy for one of their new upcoming products, I took that chance. So in your early career, that's also the mentality you should have. And that is why knowing what to lose and being forced to walk down an unconventional path, but finding my way, crawling out of that to success, is a big reason why I founded UXGO alongside a few other mentors and coworkers of mine. A lot of us coaches at UXGO, we actually come from very unconventional paths. One of our lead coaches, Jason, who isn't here today, actually graduated from communications at UW, which is a very, very hard record to go into UX research, and then he worked at Disney and Google. So a lot of us have this experience of not being able to take that standard, easy path. So that's why now, as a mentor or educator, I want to promote this idea that all of this is okay. Just make sure you find yourself, and there's always other resources for you, right? You could find good mentors, peers, find folks that you can be vulnerable to, where you can be self-critical with them. Because our industry, what you really need to know and take away from today's thing, if there's only one thing you take away, is our industry is really mentorship driven. Sheng, who couldn't join us today, is one of my mentors. I consider Rachel one of my mentors as well. So having these folks in your career and in your personal life will help you be a lot more successful. Whether it's just reaching out for mocks, reviews, or any sort of feedback, these are all folks that will help you through your iteration, right? Because it is bound to be a challenging process. So the takeaway from chapter 2 is I want all of you to feel comfortable to embrace your uniqueness and walk those unconventional paths as long as you have that career set, career plan, and that research done properly ahead of time. So now we go into the last chapter before we do our raffling and take another break. I know a lot of you may need to take a bio break, so definitely feel free to run out like some other folks have already done. So in the last chapter, I know this is often the hardest for students to hear. We need to talk about results. This was something my dad always told me. Now, I don't want to paint my dad as this super negative figure in my life that I had to overcome. I love my dad a lot, but my dad was a very traditional man of the house. He was great at everything, right? He went to the top school in China, which is called Beida. And he has a PhD in physics at Rice University, which is another very good school in Rice, Houston, Texas. So in a way, he's a real rocket scientist, right? So when I was struggling in my earlier career days, I had a very tough relation with him because he was so smart. And in my mind, there's nothing that's a challenge to him. He knows how to do everything, right? So like my most traditional Aryan parents, I've never heard a single word of encouragement from him. Like nowadays, when we call, sometimes he asks me how work is. And I remember one time he said, he was pretty proud of me. And I said, did you have to add the word pretty proud? You could just have said, I am proud of you, right? But that is as close as I got to a word of encouragement. But back then when I was struggling, this was something that really made me feel unmotivated, and I was very unhappy with the relationship we had. But I think at the end of the day, there are points where he said were valid. We live in a cruel world, and there are, of course, no medals for coming in second, especially when it comes to recruitment. And that was something my dad always reminded me of throughout my entire life, which I want to pose this question to all of you now. After listening to everything I've shared so far, do you agree with that sentiment? Do you feel like there's some sort of middle ground? Or should we all be result-driven like my dad was? So what I want to say is, with a few more years of experience looking back, in my early days of struggling, whether through university or before that, I don't think he was fully right. Yes, it's true that you can't put your resume or all the things you could have done or would have worked on your resume. It is true that nobody cares about the process, and it is true that nobody is going to give you credit for it. Nobody except one person. There is one person who should care about that process and give yourself credit for it. So by now you're probably thinking, well, who is that? So if you've heard how I set it up, you probably can guess that person is yourself. So why should you give yourself credit when no one else cares? Also, I love this image Jean-Marie added for shit happens in our life. The reason why we need to be the only person who cares about this process is we need to give ourselves empathy. If we think back to our metaphor of design thinking, empathy is such a big part of design. This is something a lot of the speakers talked about as well. So what is empathy? It's this buzzword that people throw around all the time. Empathy is something you have to give yourself first before considering giving to others. So whether we talk about from research, goal setting, iterating, putting yourself out the comfort zone, yada, yada, empathy is being able to view all these things in the correct lens. Giving yourself empathy is not easy if you're someone like me. I've dealt with a lot of ups and downs, even recently. A few years ago, right, when COVID just happened, I was rescinded one of my dream offers because it's the start of pandemic and no one knew what to do. Last year, I had to turn down a very good career offer of mine because, well, I had chest surgery at the time and it didn't really go well. So I was in the hospital for 3 months. So I'm very grateful to even be alive and speaking with you here. So overall, a lot of crap can happen and a lot of unlucky things can happen. But I still view myself as both a very unlucky and lucky person at the same time. So the one quote I want to share with all of you here today is, the only thing we have control over is how we react to things when they are out of control. So the trick of giving yourself empathy with this quote in mind is you need to consider your UX career an infinite game. So what is an infinite game, right? So this is a concept in game theory and it's quite easy to understand. There are 2 types of games. The first are finite and then we have infinite. So finite games are like football. There are a clear set of rules and there is only one winner after that game. An infinite game has no rules and can have any definition or any infinite amount of winners, and there's no end to that game. Because there are limited amounts of positions each year, if you think about recruitment, I know many folks may think of recruitment as a finite game where there are clear rules and there are clear winners. However, I don't think that's accurate. The truth about your long-term professional career that's years and years ahead of you is it will be an infinite game. And that's something I try to remind myself now as well. Some days you are ahead and some days you are behind. So as cliche as this may sound, it is true. Your only competition is with who you were at yesterday. But the tricky thing is it's very easy to turn this empathy into excuses for yourself, which you should never make. Because you already know from what I shared, it is going to be tough. So using one of my closest students and good friend, Yvette, as example, Yvette is a master's student from California College of Arts, who I had the chance to mentor, coach, and have one-on-one classes with last year. We've done a lot of classes through UXGO. She is a very talented designer. She just came from China. She went to one of the top art schools in China called Zhongyang Meiyuan. So it's a very competitive school, but this was her first year in America. And she was very shy with her English communication skills. She didn't speak any English at all. So what I told her was, I said, Yvette, you learn very fast, but I want you to start spending 30 minutes every day recording yourself and sending me that recording to me of you talking about your work. This can be fake interviews, this can be presentations, doesn't matter what the format is, send it to me. Did she do it? Well, of course she didn't, right? Who wanted to record themselves for 30 minutes a day and send it to someone? So when her first interview with Amazon came, she blew it. We spent a lot of time prepping all the slides. I've worked with another interviewer at Amazon. We taught her how to answer all the behavioral questions. Many of you may have seen the articles I've wrote on like the leadership principles and all. But even with all the preparation, she felt very hurt in her confidence. She was very disappointed in herself. And in other words, she feels like she has failed me. So she admitted to me and herself that communication gave her cold feet during the interview. She knew the answer for every question, but she was unable to answer them. So she was very frustrated. So the conclusion she gave me was, being fluent in a new language is not something anyone can learn within a few months or even a few years. So I don't think she was wrong about that, but this is where I invited another coach, Hannah, to share her thoughts with her. So Hannah never really spoke English, and even nowadays she doesn't even speak English other than with her friends and coworkers. So it was very hard for Hannah to learn a new language as well. Yet at work, Hannah has always been complimented on her communication skills and strong logical thinking. She's able to leave the impression on her team because she's very confident and she uses simple words to get straight to the point. So I had Hannah talk with the vet and told her the challenges she are not facing is not impossible to overcome. Hannah still doesn't know a lot of common words in English, but that doesn't stop her from being one of the best presenters in UX design. Of course, to further help Yvette boost her confidence, we did a lot more practice. Me, Hannah, we set up a lot of mocks. And we told her, of course, give yourself empathy, but that's not the same as avoiding the root problem you need to overcome. So we can acknowledge that you need to work towards your milestones maybe slower than others, and English is something that you need to improve day by day. So it's okay to know all of these things, but it's not okay to say, this is not something I can overcome. So with Hannah and my support, eventually being the artistic and talented designer, Yvette found a good home for her, Just 4 months later, after the failed Amazon interview, she landed a full-time role at Apple with no prior experience working in America. So very impressive accomplishment. And then when Yvette called me, she, of course, was in tears of joy. She said, "Oh, this felt so surreal. I felt like I never could have done it without you, blah, blah, blah." And then I said, "Well, it's not really a surprise to me because I told her, I felt like you were someone, if you have just done what I've said, you probably could have gotten the Amazon role as well." But I told her I was very proud of the work she's done to better herself. And looking back, out of all the advice I'm giving you today, alongside giving Yvette, self-empathy is a very important one that I personally have lacked in all my earlier career. So nowadays, if something doesn't go as planned, it's still very easy for me to blame it all on myself. But if you ever work with me in the future, you will know at the end of the day, even as being hardcore or as intense as myself, sort of like my father before me, I know how important empathy is in design, to ourselves and to each other. So now, as a mentor and coach to many of our students, we need to know that your design career doesn't exist in a vacuum. So as a few key takeaways before we go into our break, to all of you attending the event today, use your design thinking and UX thinking on your career. Think of your career as a product that requires careful planning, research, iteration, and it should be results driven. Take the time to discover who you are, create the roadmap for the next 5 years of your career, but make sure you set up concrete milestones along the way. Keep yourself running. If you ever feel comfortable in your environment, it means you are not learning. So don't compare yourself with others. Focus on getting the experiences you need, and it's okay to struggle to reach these milestones. So the last one, make sure you are giving yourself empathy, not excuses. So thank you everyone for what I just shared. We will be doing raffling, so thank you.